And what I hear both of you expressing is the important work, and you articulate very profoundly, Bryant, between understanding the trauma and the grief, but also the ability to speak, even carrying those with you. And you talk about carrying that and understanding that, living that. What does the understanding of a witness as looking at Baldwin and your own lives and work, what does that role mean in what we're experiencing, what you're experiencing? What does it mean to be a witness in history, different from the roles of such as a perpetrator or victim or bystander ally? And why is the responsibility of a witness so important?
Yeah, what you cannot divorce from Baldwin is he is not just a philosopher. He's not just a sociologist in this way. He's also a theologue, right? He wrestles with the institution of Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And its consequences around the world. More importantly, with his own self having grown up in Harlem, being the product of not just the Black church, but the Black Pentecostal church, right? And so that comes with its own embedded trauma, which is only a reverberation of the continuing colonial aspect of the faith, right? Or the faith that we've inherited since our being here on these shores. So for me, what it means to be a witness, and I think you've articulated it well, even in your question, it means so many different things, right? But what we cannot divorce from witness is work, right? And to worship God in spirit and in truth is to work for God and in spirit and truth, right? That root word for worship is indeed work, right? So for me to be a witness in this way, and this is what I hope from, and this speaks to the conversation you and I had before this interview, is that to be a witness right now is to not just articulate the racial problem. And you'll see this throughout I'm Not Your Negro, even in a conversation I cannot tell, I don't remember if it was a late night show or something, but basically to suggest that it's not enough to realize the trauma. He says essentially, Black people know exactly who white people are, right? We learn your history, we learn your traditions, which is why he has such a problem even with his own faith formation, because it is a consequence of white colonial behavior, right? And so he says, we know exactly who you are, right? But you've never taken the time to see or learn or want to deal with who I am. So right now, what we're seeing throughout America, and especially with I would almost say within our, this is, I don't want to say it and make it seem as though we're doing great work in our conference or even in our denomination, but to do the work of for those churches that are committed to having the conversation of realizing who Black folks are. How long are you going to theorize or process that? And then when will you actually implement it? So to be a witness is not just to identify the trauma, which is why I think Christians' work is so important. It's not just to theorize that, but now it's time to figure out how we implement it. And do you implement and theorize at the same time, right? Because the wheels of justice, they do turn, but they turn slow. And not only do they turn, sometimes I wonder if we have square wheels instead of round ones.
Yeah, and
So
that's a great, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, I was just saying, I think that this is why, and again, my thought with a Baldwin or a King, and I mentioned this in a sermon I preached not too long ago, that Martin King, when Martin King is killed in 1968 at the age of 39, they did an autopsy on his body shortly thereafter, And what they discovered was not just the consequences of being shot due to a racial pandemic that's been going on for 400 years, and Baldwin speaks about that as well, but the fact that when they did his autopsy, his heart was the age of a 60-year-old.
Yeah.
Trauma of blacks and somehow articulated. And the question I have, especially for those, not that it work that you're looking, I might be a little unstable. It said I was unstable, but anyway, which is why I think Christians work. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. I think there was a little bit of interference over the last minute, so I apologize for that. You were saying a question was important to address, and then perfect timing, it cut off again. So.
Oh, well, I was saying that now the time is implementation, which is why I think Christians' role in this way is incredibly important. And the concern I have, and what I'm hopeful by, is that commitment to addressing these issues requires resource. And so actually carving these things out in your budgets to say, hey, we're not only going to identify folks to process that trauma, but these are people who are willing enough to receive the resource to help us address it so that we can do the work. So this is why I think Christian's role is important, and I'm sure he has more to add to this, but to be a witness at this moment is not just to process, but to practice.
That's
good. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Christian? Yeah, Brian started preaching there. I was getting a little happy while I was on
That's good. That's good.
But the whole witness aspect, you know, there's several types of witnesses outside of the Christian sphere or Christian understanding. But they all boil down to two types of witnesses, active and passive. Which one are you going to be, right? And if we're going to be active witnesses, we have to understand what it means to be actively Christian, actively faithful. And that's, you know, not only seeing what happens, but knowing and educating ourselves and renewing our own minds and getting into the game, doing the work, because we know faith without works is dead. But through no works of our own, you know, do we perpetuate righteousness in the world, but it's all through God. So are we going to be active conduits of God's work in the world? Or are we going to be passive and let history pass us by and let us fall back into the cycles of history again, because people who do not know their history are doomed to repeat it, right? So one of the things that, you know, there was a constant throwback to witnessing throughout the entire movie. Like one of the things I actually want to ask the participants, what did they witness? Have they witnessed these kind of images before, right? Many of them grew up with those same commercials, with those same print ads and that kind of thing. And we're seeing history repeat itself in the news. Right? I mean, we had the civil rights, the riots after Martin Luther King was assassinated. We had the riots after the Rodney King beating in the streets after we saw it. You know, we've seen riots over the past, 40, 50 some odd days all across the country because Black lives matter and people fail to realize it. And there's, you know, semblances of symbolic gestures all across the country. You know, the painting of Black Lives Matter in different plazas and out front of Trump's tower. We didn't ask for all that. It's nice. It's pretty. We thank you for the recognition. However, when is the work going to be done, right? When is more work going to be done? That legislation, that becoming active in the civic center in order to push legislation to make lives matter, to make those Black lives matter, you know? And that's basically the crux of the work that I do here and the work that that I connect folks back at home in the North Texas and Central Texas Conference to do, to be involved with their federal legislators in order to push the needle towards justice. I mean, to bend the moral arc of the universe a little bit more towards justice.
Thank you. Now, alongside that, I think in terms of churches. So we're not wanting to placate the idea of being a witness as simply understanding what it means to be a witness, but to act. And that's an incredible and important distinction. So what does that look like for white churches seeking to address not just this mentally or in a way that is just analytical, but truly entering into a relationship or becoming flesh and blood on the ground work? How do y'all see churches partaking in this, particularly white churches?
I'll let Christian start that one.
I was going to defer to Brian.
You can go back and forth all day.
With the conversations that I've had with, you, Adam, and with others, and, even here within the General Board of Church and Society, first thing that needs to happen is to really realize where we are in time right now.
Mm-hmm.
And to realize what place in which each individual and each organization has played into this historical trend of anti-Black sentiment, of colonialism, of racism, of all the other isms and phobias, how we've all participated in it, right? And then from there needs to be a recognition that we all have skin in the game. Because as Martin Luther King says, that you can't be what you ought to be. I can't be what I ought to be until you become who you are, and you can't become who you are until I can become who I. So there is that interconnectedness that we have in humanity, despite our differences, right? And as long as one person is suffering, everybody else in the world is suffering. We're all suffering from something. And most commonly, we're all suffering from some part of the sin of racism all throughout history, right? As Dr. Zan Wesley Holmes used to say, there's some folks that are so poor that all that they have is money, right? So we're all suffering from some kind of system that stems from the sin of racism here in America, and throughout the world, because colonialism is an extension of the racism that was codified here in America.
Of course, and it still perpetuates in different forms.
Right. So we got to realize where we are in time, and that we all have skin in the game, and then move beyond the books and Bible studies into praxis. And I'll just stop there and leave it to Brian.
So I've been having this conversation, and I think it hinges on this plan. 5 things. I think it's 5. Repentance, reparations, reconstruction, then reconciliation. Therefore, there cannot be reconciliation without repentance. Repentance, for me, is an acknowledgement that you have gotten it wrong, period. From and for Baldwin, it is to kind of show where, right? So the consequences of the colonialism in this nation is the decimation of Native Americans and the dehumanization of Black people.